You are sitting there listening to someone explain a story that is supposed to make everything fit together. At first it feels complete. Every piece seems connected. Every answer appears to lead naturally to the next answer. Every doubt seems to have a place waiting for it. You nod. You follow along. You feel that quiet relief that comes whenever reality starts looking simpler than it actually is. Then something happens. It is usually small, so small that most people ignore it. A detail, a question, a contradiction that appears for half a second before being pushed away. But once you notice it, you cannot completely unsee it. Suddenly the story that looked solid starts feeling different. Not false, not necessarily wrong, just fragile. And that is where the discomfort begins. Because most people assume certainty collapses when a huge argument destroys it. In reality, certainty often begins collapsing because of one tiny crack. One question that should have an answer, but somehow never receives one. One missing piece everyone quietly steps around. One uncomfortable possibility that nobody wants to examine for too long. Think about how many times you have experienced this outside of religion, philosophy, politics, or any major worldview. You trusted someone completely until one small inconsistency appeared. You believed a relationship was healthy until one strange conversation stayed in your mind for weeks. You thought you understood yourself until you caught yourself repeating the same mistake again. The collapse never started with the final realization. The collapse started with the first unanswered question. What makes this so uncomfortable is that human beings are not built to enjoy uncertainty. We crave stories because stories create order. Stories tell us who we are. Stories tell us where we belong. Stories tell us what matters. Stories tell us what suffering means. Stories tell us what our sacrifices are for. And perhaps most importantly, stories protect us from the terrifying possibility that nobody actually knows as much as they think they do. Imagine a child asking a simple question. Why, then another why, then another. Eventually every parent reaches a point where the answers run out. Not because the parent is ignorant, not because the parent is lying, but because every explanation eventually rests on something deeper that remains unexplained. The older you become, the more you realize that adulthood is often just learning how many foundations are built on assumptions nobody can fully prove. Yet most people spend their lives acting as if those assumptions are unshakable. That is why moments of doubt feel so threatening. They do not merely challenge an idea. They challenge the psychological stability that idea provides. And this is where the whole story begins to feel different. Not because a conclusion has been reached, not because an argument has been won, but because a deeper question emerges. What if certainty itself is the thing we are protecting? What if the real fear is not discovering that a belief is wrong? What if the real fear is discovering how much of our identity depends on believing it is right? Think about a moment when someone challenged something important to you. Maybe it was a belief. Maybe it was a political opinion. Maybe it was your understanding of yourself. Maybe it was a life decision you had already committed years to pursuing. Notice what happened emotionally before any logical analysis occurred. The reaction came first. Defensiveness arrived before evidence. Anxiety arrived before reasoning. Discomfort arrived before investigation. Human beings like to imagine that beliefs are built entirely through logic. Psychology tells a more complicated story. We often form emotional attachments first and construct intellectual defenses afterward. If this realization has ever crossed your mind, leave a comment and explain what happened. Was there ever a moment when one question made you reconsider something you had accepted for years? Not because someone forced you to change your mind, but because you could no longer ignore the tension between what you believed and what you observed. Those moments reveal something fascinating about the human condition. We do not merely believe ideas. We live inside them. They become part of the architecture of our reality. And when one part of that architecture begins shaking, the fear is not that we will lose an argument. The fear is that we will lose the map that helped us navigate existence. This is why people sometimes avoid certain questions, even when they claim to value truth above everything else. It is not always dishonesty. Often it is self-preservation. Consider the employee who suspects their dream career is making them miserable. Consider the spouse who senses something is broken but avoids discussing it. Consider the person who feels empty despite achieving everything they once wanted. The evidence may be visible. The tension may be obvious. Yet confronting it threatens an entire narrative. And narratives are powerful things. They organize chaos. They provide continuity. They transform random experiences into meaningful journeys. The problem appears when protecting the narrative becomes more important than examining reality. That is when the crack starts widening. That is when the story becomes vulnerable. Because every worldview eventually encounters questions it struggles to answer completely. Every philosophy encounters paradoxes. Every ideology encounters contradictions. Every person encounters experiences that refuse to fit neatly into the framework they inherited. Some people interpret this as evidence that the framework is broken. Others interpret it as evidence that reality is more complex than the framework anticipated. The interesting part is not which conclusion they reach. The interesting part is watching how they respond to uncertainty itself. Some become curious, some become angry, some become fearful, some become obsessed, some double down, some walk away, and some spend years trapped between competing possibilities, unable to fully commit to either side. Maybe you have been there. Maybe you are there right now. You feel the tension between wanting certainty and wanting honesty. You want answers, but you also want those answers to survive scrutiny. You want meaning, but you do not want meaning purchased at the cost of self-deception. You want confidence, but you do not want confidence that depends on ignoring difficult questions. That psychological conflict may be one of the most universal human experiences. It appears in relationships. It appears in careers. It appears in personal identity. It appears in moral decisions. It appears in our understanding of reality itself. And the more seriously you take the search for truth, the more uncomfortable that conflict becomes. Because eventually you discover something nobody prepared you for. The strongest stories are not necessarily the stories with no questions. The strongest stories may be the ones capable of surviving questions. Yet many people spend their lives avoiding precisely the questions that would test the strength of their beliefs. They confuse protection with strength. They confuse silence with certainty. They confuse repetition with proof. They convince themselves that unanswered questions do not matter because answering them feels dangerous. But danger is often where growth begins, not because every challenge leads to a better conclusion, not because every doubt is justified, but because refusing to investigate guarantees stagnation. Somewhere along the way, many people learn to fear uncertainty more than error. They would rather possess a flawed answer than admit they do not know. They would rather defend a familiar story than risk entering unknown territory. Yet history is filled with examples of progress emerging from people willing to ask uncomfortable questions. Not because those people enjoyed uncertainty. They often hated it. They simply feared self-deception more, and that distinction changes everything. Imagine standing at the edge of a forest at night. Behind you is the path you know. Ahead of you is darkness. The path behind may not actually lead where you think it leads, but it feels safe because it is familiar. The forest ahead might contain better answers. It might contain worse answers. It might contain no answers at all. The point is that you do not know, and that ignorance creates anxiety. Most people assume courage means certainty. In reality, courage often means moving forward despite uncertainty. That realization becomes crucial when examining any story that claims to explain reality. Because the moment a difficult question appears, you face a choice. Ignore it, rationalize it, explore it, or live honestly with the fact that some questions remain unresolved. If you disagree with any of this, explain why in the comments. Not because disagreement is a problem, but because the most revealing conversations often begin where certainty starts breaking down. What makes this topic so emotionally powerful is that everyone watching is carrying some story that helps them make sense of life. Everyone. The skeptic, the believer, the optimist, the cynic, the philosopher, the scientist, the dreamer, the realist. No one escapes the need for narratives. The real question is not whether you have one. The real question is what happens when that narrative encounters something it cannot easily explain. That is where the entire psychological drama begins. That is where emotional comfort collides with intellectual honesty. That is where identity collides with curiosity. And that is where the whole story sometimes starts falling apart. Or perhaps something even more unsettling begins happening. Perhaps the story doesn't fall apart at all. Perhaps it transforms into something more complicated, more uncertain, and more honest than the version you started with. And that possibility may be far more frightening than discovering you were wrong. The strangest part is that the moment the crack appears, life outside the argument starts changing too. You begin noticing things you never noticed before. Conversations feel different. Certain explanations that once sounded convincing now feel incomplete. Certain questions that once seemed ridiculous suddenly feel impossible to ignore. It is almost like waking up after years of living inside a room with tinted windows and realizing the world outside has colors you never knew existed. Yet there is no excitement in the beginning. Most people imagine that questioning deeply held assumptions feels liberating. Often it feels terrifying, because when a story begins losing its grip, it rarely takes only one belief with it. It starts pulling on everything connected to that belief. Think about the person who spends 20 years chasing success. They tell themselves that happiness is waiting on the other side of achievement. They work longer hours. They sacrifice relationships. They postpone rest. They postpone joy. They postpone life itself. Then one day they finally arrive. The promotion comes, the money comes, the recognition comes. The thing they spent years pursuing is finally theirs. And for a brief moment they feel victorious. Then something unexpected happens. Nothing changes. The emptiness they expected to disappear remains exactly where it was. Now they face a dilemma that is far more painful than failure. If failure had happened, the story would still be intact. Success would remain the explanation. Success would remain the promise. Success would remain the destination. But after achieving it, the story itself becomes the problem. Suddenly, the question is no longer how to reach the goal. The question becomes whether the goal was ever capable of delivering what was promised. That is a much harder question to live with, because now the threat is not external. The threat comes from inside the narrative itself. This pattern repeats everywhere. A person spends years believing that finding the perfect relationship will solve their loneliness. Another spends years believing independence will solve their unhappiness. Someone else believes recognition will finally make them feel valuable. Another believes certainty will finally make them feel safe. Then reality arrives and quietly refuses to cooperate with the script. Not completely, not dramatically. Just enough to create tension. Just enough to plant doubt. Just enough to make the person wonder whether they misunderstood something fundamental. That is when the whole psychological struggle becomes intensely personal, because it is no longer about ideas floating in abstraction. It becomes about identity. The reason these moments feel so destabilizing is because human beings often confuse explanations with reality. We create narratives to interpret our experiences. Then we gradually forget that they are interpretations. We start treating them as reality itself. Eventually, the map becomes more important than the territory. The explanation becomes more important than the observation. The story becomes more important than the experience. And once that happens, any contradiction feels like an attack. Not because someone is attacking us, because our minds experience challenges to the story as threats to survival. Consider how often people argue past each other. One person presents evidence, the other person presents counter-arguments. Neither side changes, neither side listens, neither side appears interested in discovering whether they are wrong. At first glance, it looks irrational, but beneath the surface, something much deeper is happening. Each person is protecting an identity. Each person is defending a framework that helps organize their world. If the framework collapses, uncertainty rushes in, and uncertainty feels dangerous. So they defend the narrative, not necessarily because it is true, not necessarily because it is false, because it is familiar. Familiarity has enormous psychological power. It can make weak explanations feel strong. It can make contradictions seem invisible. It can make people tolerate situations that clearly no longer serve them. Think about the relationship everyone knows should end, but continues for years. Think about the job someone hates, but refuses to leave. Think about the habits people complain about while repeating them every day. Familiarity creates comfort even when it creates suffering. That is one of the most uncomfortable truths about human behavior. We often choose familiar pain over unfamiliar uncertainty. The reason this matters is because the moment the story starts falling apart, uncertainty becomes unavoidable. The old explanation stops working. The new explanation has not arrived yet. You find yourself trapped between worlds. Anyone who has gone through a major transformation recognizes this stage immediately. It is the period where old certainties are gone, but new certainties have not formed. It feels like standing on a bridge that is collapsing behind you while disappearing into fog ahead of you. You cannot return. You cannot clearly see where you are going, yet somehow you keep moving. This transitional state creates some of the most profound psychological experiences a person can have. It forces honesty. It exposes hidden motivations. It reveals fears that previously remained invisible. Suddenly you realize how many beliefs were serving emotional needs rather than intellectual conclusions. You realize how many decisions were driven by fear rather than conviction. You realize how many assumptions were inherited rather than examined. None of this automatically tells you what is true, but it changes the way you approach truth. Instead of asking what conclusion feels safest, you begin asking what questions deserve investigation. That shift sounds small. It is enormous, because certainty seeks protection, curiosity seeks understanding. And those are not always the same thing. There is a moment many people experience during deep personal change that almost nobody talks about. It happens late at night, or during a long drive, or while staring at a ceiling after everyone else has gone to sleep. A thought enters the mind. What if I have been defending something simply because I'm afraid of what happens without it? The question is uncomfortable because it applies everywhere. What if your view of yourself depends on a story you are afraid to challenge? What if your understanding of success depends on assumptions you never examined? What if your fears are being sustained by narratives that feel true but have never been tested? What if your confidence is actually avoidance wearing a disguise? Questions like these are dangerous in the best and worst sense of the word. They can lead people toward greater honesty. They can also lead people into endless confusion if they become obsessed with doubt itself. That is another trap many overlook. Some people worship certainty, others worship skepticism. Both can become prisons. Blind certainty refuses questions. Blind skepticism refuses answers. Both protect themselves from vulnerability. Both create the illusion of control. The deeper challenge is learning how to live between those extremes, to remain open without becoming lost, to remain critical without becoming cynical, to remain curious without becoming consumed by endless doubt. Few people master that balance. Most swing between extremes. One year they trust everything. The next year they trust nothing. One year they crave certainty. The next year they reject all certainty. Yet reality rarely rewards extremes. Reality tends to be more complicated than our emotional preferences, and that complexity frustrates us because complexity does not provide the clean emotional resolution we want. We want villains and heroes. We want simple answers. We want clear conclusions. We want certainty about the future. We want certainty about ourselves. We want certainty about existence. But reality keeps resisting simplification. The more carefully you examine life, the more ambiguity you encounter. Relationships contain contradictions. Human beings contain contradictions. Motivations contain contradictions. Even our deepest values sometimes conflict with each other. The search for truth becomes difficult, not because truth is necessarily hidden, but because human beings often demand a level of simplicity reality refuses to provide. If you have ever experienced a period where everything you thought you understood suddenly felt uncertain, write about it below. Many people quietly endure these moments, believing they are alone. They are not. In fact, these periods of confusion may be among the most universal experiences people share. The difference is that some admit it while others hide it, and hiding it often comes at a cost, because suppressed questions rarely disappear. They linger, they wait, they return during moments of silence, they return during moments of failure, they return during moments of unexpected success. Eventually, they demand attention. The reason the whole story appears to fall apart is not always because the story is wrong. Sometimes it is because the story was too small. Sometimes the framework that once helped you understand reality becomes insufficient as your understanding grows. A child's explanation of the world is not necessarily false. It is simply incomplete. The same may be true of many narratives we carry into adulthood. They helped us once, they provided structure, they provided meaning, they provided direction. But eventually, reality presents experiences they cannot fully contain. That is when expansion becomes necessary. And expansion almost always feels like loss before it feels like growth. Something must be released before something larger can emerge. The problem is that during the transition, it is impossible to know exactly what is being lost and what is being gained. All you feel is instability. All you feel is uncertainty. All you feel is the uncomfortable sensation that the ground beneath you is shifting. Yet beneath that discomfort, another realization is quietly approaching. A realization that changes the nature of the entire conflict. Because the deepest question may not be whether the story survives. The deepest question may be why we need the story to survive at all. The question sits there longer than most people expect. Why do we need the story to survive? At first, the answer seems obvious. We need stories because stories give life meaning. Stories help us endure suffering. Stories connect the past to the future. Stories transform random events into coherent journeys. Without them, existence can feel chaotic and directionless. But if you stay with the question long enough, something more unsettling begins to emerge. Perhaps the deeper issue is not meaning. Perhaps the deeper issue is control. Human beings have always struggled with uncertainty. We do not know how much time we have. We do not know what tomorrow brings. We do not know why certain tragedies happen and others do not. We do not know why some people suffer more than others. We do not know why life unfolds the way it does. Faced with that uncertainty, the mind naturally starts building structures. It builds explanations. It builds identities. It builds expectations. It builds stories. And over time, those stories become psychological shelter. The problem begins when shelter becomes confinement. Imagine someone who has lived their entire life inside a house they inherited. The walls are familiar. The rooms are familiar. The furniture is familiar. Every corner contains memories. They know exactly where everything is. Then one day they discover cracks running through the foundation. At first they ignore them. Then they explain them away. Then they stop looking. But the cracks remain. Eventually a choice must be made. Stay inside and pretend nothing is wrong, or step outside and face the possibility that the house is not what they thought it was. Most people imagine the terrifying part is discovering the damage. Often the terrifying part is stepping outside, because once you leave, you cannot unknow what you have seen. You cannot return to the same innocence. You cannot reconstruct the same certainty. And this is where many of the biggest turning points in life occur. Not when people find answers, but when they become willing to live without immediate answers. That sounds simple until you experience it. Because uncertainty does not feel philosophical when it arrives in your life. It feels personal. It feels emotional. It feels like standing in the middle of a storm while every familiar landmark disappears. The person who thought they understood love discovers heartbreak. The person who thought they understood success discovers emptiness. The person who thought they understood themselves discovers contradictions they cannot explain. The person who thought they had everything figured out suddenly finds themselves awake at 3 in the morning, staring into darkness with questions that refuse to leave. Those moments reveal something profound. The stories we create are not merely intellectual constructions. They are emotional survival mechanisms. They help us manage fear. They help us manage uncertainty. They help us manage mortality. They help us manage the uncomfortable reality that much of existence remains beyond our control. This is why challenges to those stories often provoke such intense reactions. The reaction is rarely about facts alone. It is about stability. It is about security. It is about identity. Yet there is another side to this. Something many people only discover after the story begins breaking apart. Beyond the fear, beyond the confusion, beyond the uncertainty, there is a strange kind of freedom. Not the freedom of knowing everything, the freedom of no longer pretending you do. There is relief in admitting that some questions are difficult. There is relief in admitting that reality may be more complicated than any single explanation can capture. There is relief in letting go of the impossible burden of certainty. Think about how much energy people spend defending positions they secretly doubt. Think about how much anxiety comes from trying to appear certain when uncertainty is the more honest response. Think about how exhausting it is to protect an image of confidence that constantly requires maintenance. Now imagine releasing that burden. Imagine saying that you are still exploring. Imagine admitting that some questions remain open. Imagine becoming more interested in understanding than in winning. For many people, that shift feels less like defeat and more like awakening, because the goal was never certainty itself. The goal was truth. And truth is not always accompanied by comfort. Sometimes it demands humility. Sometimes it demands patience. Sometimes it demands the courage to sit with unresolved tension longer than you want to. This is where many psychological transformations reach their most important stage. Not when the old story dies, not when the new story appears, but when a person realizes they are bigger than either story. They begin to understand that identity does not have to depend entirely on being right. Curiosity becomes possible again. Growth becomes possible again. Learning becomes possible again. The fear of being wrong starts losing its power, and that changes everything. Because once the fear of being wrong weakens, questions stop feeling like threats. They become invitations. An unanswered question becomes an opportunity rather than a danger. A contradiction becomes something to investigate rather than suppress. A challenge becomes something to learn from rather than something to defeat. This shift is rare because it requires a level of honesty many people spend their entire lives avoiding. Honesty about uncertainty, honesty about motivation, honesty about fear, honesty about the possibility that some of our strongest convictions may contain elements we have never fully examined. Yet those who make that shift often describe a surprising outcome. They do not become less engaged with life. They become more engaged. They notice more. They listen more carefully. They ask better questions. They become less interested in protecting conclusions and more interested in understanding reality. And reality, as it turns out, is endlessly more fascinating than certainty. The irony is that the collapse of a story often feels like an ending when it is actually a beginning. The person standing among the ruins of an old narrative assumes they have lost something essential. In some cases they have. But they have also gained something. They have gained awareness, they have gained perspective, they have gained the ability to see beyond assumptions that once felt invisible. The discomfort remains, the uncertainty remains, the unanswered questions remain. Yet there is also a growing sense of authenticity, a feeling that whatever comes next will be built on something more honest than what came before. That does not mean every old belief was wrong. It does not mean every tradition was mistaken. It does not mean every assumption collapses under scrutiny. Sometimes deeper examination strengthens what was already there. Sometimes questions reveal hidden strengths rather than weaknesses. The important point is that examination occurred. Curiosity was allowed to exist. Fear was not given total control. And perhaps that is where the whole story changes, because the real collapse was never about a specific idea. The real collapse was the illusion that certainty is the same thing as truth. Once that illusion breaks, a different kind of journey begins, a journey defined less by defending answers and more by pursuing understanding, less by protecting identity and more by exploring reality, less by clinging to conclusions and more by remaining open to discovery. That journey is uncomfortable. It can be lonely, it can be disorienting. It can force you to confront parts of yourself you would rather avoid. But it can also produce something remarkably rare in a world obsessed with certainty: intellectual humility, emotional honesty, psychological freedom. And maybe that is the final twist nobody expects. Maybe the moment where the whole story falls apart is not the tragedy we assume it is. Maybe it is the moment we stop confusing the map for the territory. Maybe it is the moment we stop demanding guarantees from a reality that offers none. Maybe it is the moment we stop treating questions as enemies. Maybe it is the moment we finally become willing to see things as they are instead of as we need them to be. And if that is true, then the crack in the story was never the end. It was the first sign that something larger was trying to emerge all along.